At precisely 6 a.m. on the morning of March 23, 1943, Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen maintained his position in a forward command post located 3 miles west of El Guettar, Tunisia. Through his field glasses, he observed 50 German tanks emerging from a mountain pass into the valley below. The morning air carried a coolness characteristic of the North African dawn, and the sky remained perfectly clear, providing exceptional visibility across the landscape. Allen could discern every detail of the German column as it descended from the elevated terrain into the valley floor. The panzers moved in precise formation, displaying the confidence that comes from victories achieved across 3 continents. 27 days prior to this moment, American forces had experienced a devastating defeat at Kasserine Pass. The losses were substantial, with 6,500 men lost and a retreat spanning 50 miles over the course of 5 days. The defeat represented a complete and humiliating setback that received considerable public attention. German military leaders openly characterized American soldiers as cowards, while British commanders questioned the fundamental combat capabilities of American forces. Newspapers throughout the United States reported the disaster with stark directness, and the credibility of the entire American war effort faced serious scrutiny. The American forces now positioned defensively across the El Guettar Valley had received orders to halt the advance of the German 10th Panzer Division. Allen had held command of the 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, for 9 months. His experience with these troops extended from training camps across the United States through transport ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean and into staging areas in Britain and North Africa. He possessed thorough knowledge of their strengths and limitations. He understood they were inexperienced, untested, and unproven in combat. However, he also recognized their American identity and the associated determination that Americans characteristically demonstrated. The central question remained whether his division would receive the opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities when provided with proper leadership, appropriate doctrine, and fair circumstances for engagement. The German attack commenced precisely as intelligence reports had predicted. The assault force included Panzerkampfwagen Mark IV tanks, Marder tank destroyers, and armored half-tracks transporting infantry. This represented the type of coordinated mechanized assault that had proven devastatingly effective in Poland, requiring only 3 weeks for conquest, and in France, requiring merely 6 weeks. This same tactical approach had driven American forces back 50 miles at Kasserine Pass less than 1 month earlier. The German forces entered the engagement with considerable confidence based on their previous victories over American units. They maintained expectations of repeating their earlier success. However, the German commanders lacked awareness that the American army positioned at El Guettar had undergone fundamental transformation from the force they had defeated at Kasserine Pass. In the span of 27 days, the United States Army had accomplished a more complete transformation than any Allied force had achieved in 3 years of warfare. The disaster at Kasserine Pass. The circumstances leading to this transformation began in the Atlas Mountains of Tunisia on February 19, 1943. On that morning, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel initiated an offensive against American positions at Kasserine Pass, a 2-mile-wide gap in the Grand Dorsal Mountain chain. The strategic significance of the pass was substantial, as control over Kasserine meant control over the mountain routes. The American forces defending the pass possessed minimal combat experience. The vast majority had never discharged weapons in actual combat situations. Their arrival in North Africa had occurred only weeks earlier as part of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. Their commanding officer, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, had deployed his forces in a tactically disadvantageous manner, distributing units into small, isolated groups that lacked mutual support capabilities. Military terminology described this deployment as penny packets, referring to small detachments assigned individual tasks without coordination. The American tanks, consisting of M3 Lee and M3 Grant models, featured high silhouettes that made them vulnerable targets. These medium tanks mounted both a 75mm gun in a side sponson and a 37mm gun in a turret. The design represented a compromise necessitated by urgent wartime production requirements rather than optimal engineering principles. The tank commanders lacked experience in engaging German armor. Their training had consisted of exercises against other American tanks in Louisiana and the Mojave Desert. German tanks demonstrated superior speed, armor protection, and were operated by veterans with combat experience from Poland, France, and Russia. The American infantry had constructed shallow scrapes rather than proper foxholes. They did not comprehend that German tanks would intentionally drive over shallow positions and rotate their tracks to crush personnel hiding there. These represented lessons that would be acquired through casualties. When German tanks attacked, the American defensive lines collapsed within hours. German panzers achieved breakthrough at the pass. Italian forces supporting the assault overran American artillery positions. The scattered American units proved incapable of coordinating a defense. They could not request artillery support because batteries only responded to their dedicated observers, and those observers operated on different radio frequencies. Air support remained non-existent. The various American units lacked information about the positions of other friendly forces. Some units retreated into positions already occupied by German forces. By the night of February 16, 1943, the Second Corps had lost 1,600 men, nearly 100 tanks, 57 half-tracks, and 29 artillery pieces. The retreat continued for 5 additional days. Rommel pushed American forces back 50 miles, capturing the towns of Sidi Bouzid, Spitla, and Friana. American soldiers abandoned equipment, supplies, and defensive positions. British forces fighting alongside the Americans also retreated, losing all 11 of their tanks. By February 22nd, when the German advance finally halted, American casualties totaled 6,500 men, including 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 missing. The Americans had lost 183 tanks, more than 500 trucks and motor vehicles, 104 half-tracks, and 208 artillery pieces. German losses amounted to 989 casualties and 34 tanks. The United States Army had experienced its most severe defeat of World War II. British military leaders questioned American competence with increasing directness. German officers openly expressed contempt for American fighting ability. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in the Mediterranean theater, informed Hitler that American soldiers demonstrated poor training and poor leadership. The crisis and response. The defeat at Kasserine Pass created a fundamental crisis for the American war effort. General Dwight Eisenhower, serving as Supreme Allied Commander in North Africa, confronted a critical question regarding whether American forces could engage German forces on equal terms, or whether the United States would need to depend on British forces to conduct the ground war in Europe. The answer to this question would determine Allied strategy for the entire war. If Americans could not defeat German forces in North Africa, their credibility for leading the invasion of France would be severely compromised. Winston Churchill maintained existing skepticism about American military capability, and after Kasserine Pass, his doubts appeared justified.
British commanders Montgomery and Alexander reached the conclusion that Americans were hopelessly trained, poorly led, made poor soldiers, and were unlikely to improve quickly. However, Eisenhower perceived something in the Kasserine defeat that others overlooked. American units had fought poorly, but they had not experienced complete disintegration. Some units had maintained their positions under impossible circumstances. American artillery, when it finally achieved organization, had stopped German advances with devastating firepower. The fundamental problem was not American soldiers, but American leadership, American doctrine, and American coordination. These represented problems that could be corrected. On February 26, 1943, just 2 days after Rommel withdrew from Kasserine Pass, Eisenhower initiated the most rapid military transformation in modern warfare.
Fredendall had never personally reconnoitered the battlefield and did not possess knowledge of the terrain. He had divided his divisions into small combat commands scattered across 50 miles of desert. When the Germans attacked, Fredendall proved incapable of coordinating a response because his units were too dispersed. Eisenhower replaced Fredendall with Major General George Patton, a 57-year-old cavalry officer who had devoted his entire career to preparing for mechanized warfare. Patton assumed command at 1,000 hours on March 6, 1943. He possessed 17 days to transform the Second Corps before Eisenhower ordered them back into battle. Patton's discipline campaign. Patton understood a fundamental principle about military organizations. They will fight with determination for a commander they fear and respect. Patton required both qualities. He initiated his command with an emphasis on discipline. Every soldier in the Second Corps received orders to wear a complete, clean, pressed uniform at all times. Soldiers who failed to wear leggings, helmets, or proper insignia faced court-martial. Officers who allowed their men to appear slovenly were relieved of command. Patton personally drove through American positions searching for violations. He stopped jeeps, inspected uniforms, and questioned soldiers about their weapons and equipment. He imposed fines of $50 on officers for not wearing neckties. He required enlisted men to dig new foxholes because the existing ones were too shallow. He maintained presence everywhere continuously, demanding perfection. The Second Corps developed strong negative feelings toward him. Soldiers characterized him as a tyrant. Officers complained that he cared more about appearances than combat. Some questioned whether Patton understood that they were preparing for battle rather than a parade ground. However, Patton understood something the soldiers did not yet grasp. An army that appeared sloppy was an army that thought in a sloppy manner. An army that tolerated low standards in appearance would tolerate low standards in combat. Patton was not concerned with neckties for their own sake, rather with building a culture of excellence. Culture began with the visible, the measurable, and the enforceable. If a soldier could not be motivated to wear his uniform correctly, the question arose regarding how he could be trusted to maintain his rifle correctly. If an officer could not enforce dress standards, the question arose regarding how he could enforce fire discipline. A transformation occurred during those 17 days. Units that had been scattered and demoralized began functioning as cohesive teams. Soldiers began taking pride in their appearance and their equipment. Morning formations became precise. Weapons received daily cleaning and inspection. Vehicles were maintained to high standards. Radio operators practiced communications procedures. Squad leaders rehearsed small unit tactics. Platoon leaders walked the ground where they would fight, studying terrain and planning defensive positions. The casual, almost careless attitude that had characterized American forces before Kasserine Pass disappeared. Men who had retreated in disorder began to believe they could advance in order. Men who had been defeated began to believe they could achieve victory. Patton was building an army that appeared professional, and more importantly, he was building an army that believed it was professional. This belief mattered fundamentally because an army that believes it will win fights differently than an army that expects to lose. Doctrinal reforms. While Patton rebuilt morale, Eisenhower rebuilt doctrine. The problems at Kasserine Pass had been systemic in nature. American artillery could not mass fires because each battery operated independently. American armor fought tank to tank instead of concentrating fire. American air support was poorly coordinated with ground operations. American commanders did not understand combined arms warfare. These were not problems that could be fixed with better soldiers, but required new tactics, new procedures, and new command structures. Eisenhower assembled his staff and gave them one order: fix everything fast. Artillery coordination received priority because artillery represented America's strongest asset. American artillery pieces were excellent in quality. American artillery ammunition was plentiful. American gunners were well trained. The problem was coordination. Before Kasserine Pass, each American artillery battery had its own dedicated observers on separate radio frequencies. A forward observer with the 3rd Battalion could only call fire from 3rd Battalion guns even if 2nd Battalion artillery was closer to the target or had better firing positions. This meant American artillery could never achieve the mass fires that made German artillery so deadly. German forward observers could call fires from any battery within range, creating sudden, overwhelming concentrations of firepower on key targets. Within 1 week of Kasserine Pass, Eisenhower's staff began developing a new fire direction system that would allow better coordination of artillery fires across multiple batteries. The technical challenges were significant. Different batteries used different radio frequencies. Fire direction centers used different procedures. Artillery officers had been trained to control only their own batteries. The solution required new radio equipment, new training, and, most importantly, a new mindset. Artillery officers had to think of artillery as a corps-level asset rather than a battalion-level asset. By early March, the new procedures were being tested in training exercises. By mid-March, when the 2nd Corps went back into combat, the artillery battalions were practicing coordinated fire missions. The change fundamentally improved American artillery effectiveness, especially when large units remained concentrated rather than dispersed. Tank doctrine. The armor reforms were more complex. American tank doctrine before Kasserine Pass emphasized tank versus tank combat. Tanks were supposed to fight other tanks. This doctrine came from the cavalry tradition. American armored forces had evolved from horse cavalry, and the cavalry mindset emphasized direct engagement with enemy cavalry. American commanders sent their armor forward to engage German panzers in direct combat. This played to German strengths. German tank commanders had 3 years of combat experience across multiple theaters. They had fought in Poland in 1939, France in 1940, and Russia from 1941 onward. They knew how to maneuver, how to use terrain, how to concentrate fire, and how to exploit weaknesses.
American tank commanders had no combat experience. They had trained in the deserts of California and the plains of Texas against other American tanks. They advanced in straight lines, exposed their flanks, and fought as individuals instead of units. At Kasserine Pass, American tanks were destroyed piecemeal because they attacked without coordination and without support. Eisenhower's staff revised American armor doctrine based on hard lessons from Kasserine. Tanks were no longer primarily weapons for fighting other tanks. Tanks were mobile fire support for infantry. American armor would advance with infantry, use terrain for cover, and rely on artillery and tank destroyers to eliminate German tanks. Tank destroyers, not tanks, would fight German armor. This was a fundamental change in American tactical thinking. The United States Army had created tank destroyer battalions specifically for this mission, equipping them with high-velocity guns mounted on mobile platforms. However, at Kasserine Pass, tank-destroyer battalions had been broken up into platoons and scattered across the battlefield. Individual platoons had been overrun or bypassed. The new doctrine called for tank-destroyer battalions to fight as unified battalions, concentrating their firepower at critical points. This required new training, new coordination, and new command relationships, but it played to American strengths. Americans had excellent artillery to suppress German tanks. They had good tank destroyers to kill German tanks. They did not need to beat Germans at their own game, but needed to fight a different game entirely. Air support and command structure. The air support reforms took longer. Coordinating aircraft with ground forces required new radio equipment, new procedures, and new training for both pilots and ground controllers. This would not be fully solved until Operation Overlord in June of 1944. However, Eisenhower started the process in March of 1943. He created air liaison officers who embedded with ground units. He established procedures for calling airstrikes. He emphasized that air superiority was a prerequisite for ground operations. American forces would not attack without control of the air. The command structure reforms were the most dramatic. Before Kasserine Pass, Fredendall had split his divisions into small combat commands, operating independently. This gave German forces the opportunity to defeat American units one by one. Eisenhower's new doctrine emphasized mass. Divisions would fight together, not separately. Combat commands would stay under divisional control. Mutual support would be mandatory. No unit would be positioned where it could not be reinforced or supported by adjacent units. These reforms happened simultaneously with Patton's discipline campaign. While Patton inspected foxholes, artillery officers practiced improved coordination procedures. While Patton demanded salutes, tank destroyer units prepared for unified employment. The combination was deliberate. Eisenhower needed soldiers who believed they were part of a professional army, and he needed that army to actually be professional. Morale and competence had to advance together. The return to battle. On March 17, 1943, 11 days after Patton took command, the 1st Infantry Division and 1st Armored Division moved forward into central Tunisia. Their objective was the town of Gafsa, an oasis in the interior plains. Intelligence reported that Gafsa was lightly defended. American forces took the town with minimal opposition. On March 18th, the 2nd Ranger Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel William Darby, pushed ahead and occupied the oasis town of El Guettar. Again, almost no opposition materialized. The Italian defenders retreated to the hills overlooking El Guettar, blocking the mountain pass that led south to the coastal plain. The 2nd Corps was now in an excellent position. If American forces could push through the El Guettar Pass to the coast, they would cut off German forces in southern Tunisia from their supply lines. The Germans would be trapped between American forces to the west and British forces advancing from the east. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commanding German forces in Tunisia after Rommel's departure on March 9th, understood this immediately. He could not allow Americans to break through at El Guettar. Arnim believed that a spoiling attack would be sufficient to drive the Americans back. On March 22nd, Arnim ordered the 10th Panzer Division to attack El Guettar and destroy American positions there. The 10th Panzer Division was one of Germany's elite armored formations. It had fought in France, Russia, and North Africa. The division's tank commanders had years of combat experience. They had destroyed hundreds of enemy tanks. They knew how to coordinate infantry, armor, and artillery. They had never lost a major engagement. The German officers planning the attack on El Guettar expected to destroy American forces the same way they had destroyed them at Kasserine Pass. They expected American units to scatter when hit by massed armor. They expected poor coordination, weak artillery, and no air support. They expected to be fighting the same American army they had defeated 4 weeks earlier. They were incorrect in this assessment. The Battle of El Guettar. At 600 hours on March 23, 1943, 50 German tanks emerged from the mountain pass into the El Guettar Valley. The sun was just rising behind the American positions, silhouetting the German column against the western mountains. Panzerkampfwagen Mark IV tanks led the advance, their long-barreled 75mm guns clearly visible. Behind them came Marder tank destroyers, open-topped vehicles mounting captured Soviet 76mm guns. Armored half-tracks carrying Panzer Grenadier infantry followed in formation. German motorcycle reconnaissance units raced ahead to scout the American positions. The German column advanced at speed, engines roaring, tank treads churning up clouds of dust that hung in the still morning air. They were attacking in the open across flat ground approximately 2 miles wide, confident that American forces would break before they reached the town. German commanders had observed Americans break at Kasserine Pass and expected the same result here. The Americans were waiting, maintaining silence and discipline while remaining invisible. Major General Terry Allen had positioned the 1st Infantry Division across the valley in depth, not in a single line. This represented a critical tactical change from Kasserine Pass. Forward units occupied high ground overlooking the valley, dug in with interlocking fields of fire. Behind them, infantry battalions were positioned in successive defensive lines, each capable of mutual support. Artillery was positioned behind the ridges, invisible to German observers, but registered on every likely avenue of approach. American forward observers occupied concealed positions with clear views of the entire valley. Tank destroyer battalions were dug in at key positions with clear fields of fire and camouflaged so thoroughly that they were invisible from more than 100 yards. Infantry had proper foxholes dug deep enough to protect from tank overrun. Every unit knew where adjacent units were positioned. Radio frequencies were coordinated across the entire division. Fire direction centers were established with direct communication to every artillery battery. Ammunition was stockpiled at gun positions. Medical aid stations were positioned to handle casualties. Supply routes were marked and secured. Minefields had been laid during the night at locations determined by analysis of German tactics at Kasserine Pass.
This was not the scattered, uncoordinated defense that had failed at Kasserine Pass. This was a prepared defensive position, built according to the new doctrine developed in the 4 weeks since Kasserine, incorporating every lesson learned from that defeat. The German tanks advanced across the valley floor, moving fast and maintaining formation, confident in their superiority. At 400 yards from the American positions, the lead tanks hit the minefield. Explosions erupted beneath Panzer chassis. Tanks stopped, tracks blown off, crews evacuating. The German column slowed, bunching up as tanks in the rear tried to avoid the mines. This was exactly what American artillery observers had been waiting for. The artillery strike came from batteries positioned throughout the sector. American forward observers had been tracking the German column since it entered the valley. They had calculated ranges, adjusted for wind, and coordinated with fire direction centers. When the Germans hit the minefield and bunched up, the order was given: fire for effect. Not just the batteries assigned to the 1st Infantry Division participated, but every battery within range. The fire included 105mm howitzers and 155mm howitzers. The concentrated fire was continuous, coordinated, and devastating. The first salvo landed among the stalled German tanks with precision. High explosive rounds detonated against panzer armor, disabling tracks and turrets. White phosphorus rounds burst overhead, showering burning chemical that adhered to metal and flesh. The second salvo landed even as the first was still exploding, then the third, then the fourth. The bombardment continued for 12 minutes without pause. German tanks that had survived the minefield were hit repeatedly by high explosive and white phosphorus rounds. Half-tracks exploded, their thin armor providing no protection against artillery fragments. Infantry who had dismounted to clear mines were caught in the open with no cover. The few German tanks that tried to retreat found their path blocked by disabled vehicles and continuing artillery fire. The German column was trapped in the killing zone, unable to advance and unable to retreat, being systematically destroyed by American artillery firing at maximum rate. The American artillery was accomplishing what it had failed to do at Kasserine Pass, delivering mass fires on a single target with improved timing and coordination, using procedures developed specifically to address the failures of Kasserine. When the artillery lifted, American tank destroyers opened fire. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion was equipped with M3 gun motor carriages, half-tracks mounting 75mm guns. They fired from concealed positions, targeting German tanks that were trying to reorganize after the artillery barrage. The tank destroyer crews had trained for exactly this scenario. They had studied German tactics and knew how panzers maneuvered. They knew where to aim and fired methodically, one tank at a time, waiting for clean shots. The 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M10 tank destroyers mounting 3-inch guns, provided additional firepower from supporting positions. The German advance collapsed. 30 tanks were destroyed or disabled by 0900 hours. The 10th Panzer Division withdrew to the mountain pass, leaving burning vehicles across the valley floor. Allen watched the retreat through field glasses and made no move to pursue. His orders were to hold Guettar, not chase Germans into the mountains. When 2 German tanks approached his headquarters during the height of the battle, staff officers suggested withdrawal. Allen refused with words that became legendary, stating that he would not pull out and would shoot the first person who did. The Americans had won their first defensive victory against German armor, but the Germans were not finished. At 1645 hours, the 10th Panzer Division attacked again, this time approaching from a different direction in an attempt to flank the American positions. The result was the same. American artillery delivered mass fires on the German column. Tank destroyers engaged from prepared positions. German tanks were destroyed before they could close with American infantry. By nightfall, the 10th Panzer Division had withdrawn permanently. They joined Italian forces in the hills east of Guettar, but made no further attempts to break through the valley. Aftermath and impact. The Battle of Guettar continued for 2 more weeks as American forces tried to push through the mountain passes. The fighting was difficult. Italian forces defending the high ground at hills 369 and 772 fought tenaciously. American attacks made limited progress, but the strategic situation had changed. On March 26th, British forces launched Operation Supercharge II, breaking through the Mareth Line to the east and forcing German forces to retreat north. The Axis position in southern Tunisia was collapsing. By April 7, 1943, American forces from Guettar linked up with elements of the British 8th Army on the Guettar to Gabas Road at 1700 hours. The remaining German forces were trapped in northern Tunisia. The campaign was effectively over. The Battle of Guettar was the first time American forces had decisively defeated German armor in combat. The victory validated every reform Eisenhower had implemented since Kasserine Pass. The improved artillery coordination had worked effectively. Tank destroyers employed as unified battalions rather than dispersed platoons had proven their worth. Combined arms coordination had been excellent. Air support, though still imperfect, had improved significantly. Most importantly, American soldiers had proven they could stand their ground against experienced German forces. The Germans noticed this change. After Guettar, German commanders stopped calling American soldiers cowards. Intelligence reports acknowledged American tactical competence. Rommel, who had been recalled to Germany 2 weeks before Guettar, later documented in his papers that American forces had recovered very quickly after their first shock and had soon succeeded in damming up German advances. The respect was grudging, but it was real. Americans could fight. The speed of transformation. What made the transformation remarkable was the speed. 27 days separated Kasserine Pass from Guettar. In that time, the Second Corps had replaced its commander, revised its doctrine, retrained its forces, and proven itself competent in combat. No other Allied army had adapted that quickly. The British Army had taken years to develop effective combined arms tactics after early defeats in France and North Africa. Soviet forces had needed 18 months after the German invasion of June 1941 to develop operational competence at Stalingrad. The Germans themselves had required extensive experience in Poland and France before perfecting their blitzkrieg tactics. The American army had accomplished it in less than 4 weeks. Factors enabling rapid adaptation. The reasons for this rapid adaptation were systemic and interconnected. First, American forces accepted that they had a problem. There was no denial, no excuses, and no blame shifting. This was remarkable given the military culture of most nations. Defeated armies typically blamed soldiers for lack of fighting spirit, blamed subordinate commanders for tactical errors, or blamed logistics for inadequate supply. They rarely blamed doctrine, and they almost never questioned fundamental assumptions about how to fight. Eisenhower and his staff conducted a brutally honest assessment of what had gone wrong at Kasserine Pass. They identified specific failures in leadership, doctrine, and coordination. They published detailed after-action reports that cataloged mistakes without euphemism. They did not blame soldiers for breaking under German attack, but blamed themselves for putting soldiers in positions where breaking was inevitable. They did not blame tank crews for losing to German panzers, but blamed doctrine for sending American tanks into fights they could not win. This allowed them to focus on fixing systems rather than punishing individuals. Officers who had commanded at Kasserine Pass were reassigned to training duties where they taught the next generation of officers what not to do. Their experience, even their failures, became institutional knowledge.
Second, American forces had the authority to make changes quickly, without waiting for approval from higher headquarters thousands of miles away. Eisenhower did not need to cable Washington for permission to relieve Fredendall. He did not need War Department approval to revise artillery doctrine or reorganize tank destroyer battalions. He had been granted theater-level authority to command as he saw fit. This was different from other Allied armies. British commanders in North Africa answered to the War Office in London, where career bureaucrats who had never heard a shot fired in anger reviewed every significant decision. British doctrine changes required committee review, formal analysis, and approval by senior officers in London who were fighting a different war. Soviet commanders answered to Stalin, who personally approved or disapproved tactical changes based on political considerations as much as military merit. German commanders answered to Hitler, who increasingly made tactical decisions from his headquarters in East Prussia based on ideology rather than battlefield reality. American commanders in the field had genuine authority to change how they fought based on what they learned. This decentralization of decision-making authority was an American military tradition dating back to the Continental Army, but it proved decisive in World War II. Third, American forces had the resources to implement changes rapidly and at scale. New equipment like M10 tank destroyers arrived within weeks of being requested, shipped across the Atlantic on fast freighters that made the crossing in under 2 weeks.
Additional artillery batteries were formed, trained, and assigned to the Second Corps. The United States Army had activated hundreds of artillery battalions in 1942 and early 1943. When Second Corps needed more artillery support, those battalions were available. Air liaison officers were trained at newly established schools and deployed to North Africa within weeks. Radio equipment that did not exist in January was being mass-produced in February and issued to units in March. The American industrial base provided whatever was needed to support the reforms. This was not propaganda or exaggeration. American factories in 1943 were producing military equipment at a rate that no other nation could match. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, rifles, ammunition, uniforms, medical supplies, food, and countless other items poured out of American factories in quantities that seemed impossible to observers from other nations. Other Allied armies had to fight with whatever equipment they had. British forces in North Africa used equipment that had been designed in the 1930s and produced in limited quantities by factories that were targets for German bombing. Soviet forces used equipment that was excellent in some categories, but chronically short in others, because Soviet industry had been devastated by the German invasion. German forces by 1943 were beginning to experience shortages of everything from fuel to ammunition to replacement vehicles, because Allied bombing and resource depletion were strangling German industry. Americans could request new equipment, new vehicles, and new weapons and receive them quickly. If something did not work, it could be replaced. If something needed to be modified, modifications could be implemented across the force. This abundance of material resources enabled rapid experimentation and rapid deployment of solutions. An army that must fight with inadequate equipment cannot afford to experiment. An army with abundant equipment can afford to try new approaches, discard what does not work, and scale up what does work. Fifth, American forces emphasized training and practice. Patton's 17-day transformation of the Second Corps focused heavily on basic skills and unit cohesion. Soldiers practiced digging proper foxholes. Tank crews practiced coordinating with infantry. Artillery batteries practiced improved fire coordination. Tank destroyer battalions trained as unified forces rather than dispersed elements. Air liaison officers practiced calling airstrikes. The training was repetitive, intensive, and focused on the specific problems identified at Kasserine Pass. By the time American forces went back into combat, they had practiced the new approaches until they became automatic. Cultural transformation. These 5 factors created an institutional culture that valued adaptation over tradition. American forces were not bound by decades of military tradition. They had no institutional investment in proving that old methods worked. They could change quickly because they had nothing to defend. This was a paradox. American inexperience, which had been a liability at Kasserine Pass, became an advantage when it came to adaptation. Inexperienced forces could learn faster because they had less to unlearn. Military historian Gerhard Weinberg captured the British failure to understand this dynamic. British commanders Montgomery and Alexander concluded after Kasserine Pass that Americans were hopelessly untrained, poorly led, made poor soldiers, and were unlikely to improve quickly. They suggested that American forces be relegated to garrison duties and logistic support, while British forces carried the main burden of combat operations. Churchill echoed these doubts in communications with Roosevelt. The British assessment was based on decades of military experience fighting the Germans. The British forces had been fighting since September of 1939. They had been defeated in France, defeated in Greece, defeated in Crete, and pushed back across North Africa before finally achieving victory at Al Alamein. The British learning curve had taken 3 full years. They assumed the Americans would need the same amount of time, if Americans could learn at all.
Weinberg observed that it was difficult to understand why the British found it so hard to comprehend that the Americans taking several months to learn what it had taken the British Army 3 years to learn was actually a good sign for the Allied cause, not a bad one. The American learning curve was steeper and faster precisely because Americans were willing to admit failure and change course. British military culture emphasized tradition, precedent, and established procedure. Changes had to be approved through formal channels, documented in regulations, and tested extensively before implementation. American military culture, particularly under Eisenhower's leadership, emphasized results over process. If something did not work, it should be changed immediately. It should be tested in combat, not in training, and refined based on battlefield results. This pragmatic approach, born of necessity and enabled by American resources, created a learning cycle measured in weeks rather than years. Long-term impact. The lessons of Kasserine Pass and Guettar spread through the entire American Army. The improved artillery coordination procedures became standard across all American units in all theaters. The emphasis on combined arms warfare was incorporated into training at Fort Benning and other stateside bases. Tank destroyer doctrine was refined to emphasize battalion-level employment rather than dispersed platoon operations. Air liaison officers were trained at newly established schools and deployed to North Africa within weeks. By the time American forces invaded Sicily on July 10, 1943, the improvements were already visible. American forces fought more effectively, coordinated better, and adapted faster to changing battlefield conditions. The invasion of Sicily in September of 1943 showed further improvement. American commanders were more aggressive. Coordination between units was smoother. Artillery support was devastating. Air support was better integrated. German forces in Italy fought defensive battles with great skill, but they could not stop the American advance. The Americans who landed at Salerno on September 9th were not the Americans who had retreated at Kasserine Pass. They were a professional, competent, combat-effective force. By June of 1944, when American forces landed at Normandy, the transformation was complete. The American army that stormed the beaches of France was one of the most effective fighting forces in the world. They had superior artillery coordination, excellent air support, good combined arms integration, and experienced leadership. They still made mistakes. The fighting in Normandy was difficult. German forces defended tenaciously, but American forces adapted to each new challenge. When they encountered hedgerows, they developed hedgerow cutters. When they faced German armor, they called in air support and tank destroyers. When German defenses proved too strong, they massed artillery and blasted through.